So, hi all, and welcome to this event organised by the Emergent Nonfiction Lab, which is part of the broader Counter Evidentiary Futures project at the University of Salford. Counter Evidentiary Futures aims to examine the future counter-hegemonic potentialities of media evidence. As an important arm of this project, the Emergent Nonfiction Lab aims to explore the violent colonial origins of nonfiction media and seeks to shift focus towards modes of counter theory and practice. Through various reading groups, talks, and symposia, the ENL investigates emerging modalities of nonfiction media theory and practice that can both challenge traditional epistemological paradigms and envision alternative futures. You can find more information about all this at counterevidentiaryfutures.com. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Michael Richardson. Michael is an associate professor of media at UNSW Sydney, where he co-directs the Media Futures Hub and Autonomous Media Lab, and an associate investigator with the ARC Centre of Excellence on Automated Decision-Making and Society. Drawing on a transdisciplinary background in media studies, cultural studies, literature, and international relations, his research examines technology, violence, and affect in war, security, and surveillance. Michael is the author of the books Gestures of Testimony, Torture, Trauma, and Affect in Literature from Bloomsbury in 2016, and Nonhuman Witnessing, War, Data, and Ecology After the End of the World from Duke University Press in 2024. And it's the latter book which is the subject of today's talk. In Nonhuman Witnessing, Michael argues that a radical rethinking of what counts as witnessing is central to building frameworks for justice in an era of endless war, ecological catastrophe, and technological capture. Dismantling the primacy and notion of traditional human-based forms of witnessing, Michael shows how ecological, machinic, and algorithmic forms of witnessing can help us better understand contemporary crises. He examines the media specificity of non-human witnessing across an array of sites, from nuclear testing on First Nations land and autonomous drone warfare, to deepfakes, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic investigative tools. Throughout, he illuminates the ethical and political implications of witnessing in an age of profound instability. By challenging the readers to rethink their understandings of witnessing, testimony, and trauma in the context of interconnected crises, Richardson reveals the complex entanglements between witnessing and violence, and the human and non-human. So thanks so much for joining us today, Michael, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you to the Emergent Nonfiction Lab for organising today. Thanks for the wonderful introduction to Patrick. Hopefully my version of the book today can live up to that lovely little summary. This is actually the first book talk I'm giving for the book, so it's a real thrill to be with you today, and thanks everybody for coming along. Okay. So, to begin, 3 images: glass bush plums capturing breath and registering the atmospherics of nuclear testing on First Nations land. Agile Condor, an aerial targeting system designed to use a low-power form of machine learning computation to select imagery of potential analysis by human operators. Triple Chaser, an object recognition algorithm for spotting tear gas canisters trained on synthetic data. What is shared by the technologies, objects, encounters, and events indexed in these images? My proposition, and the argument made in my new book, is that these are each instances of a kind of non-human witnessing, instances of the registering of violence that make an ethico-political claim on the human, even as they refuse the constraints of anthropocentric modes of knowing and communicating. So I came to this project about a half dozen years ago when I was giving a talk in Berlin, and someone in the audience, Jonas Benz, who's since become a friend, asked me, I'd given this talk about drones, and he asked me, so would you say here that the drones are a kind of non-human witness. And that question, I didn't have a good answer at the time, but that question stuck with me. And in work after that in Berlin and then elsewhere, I began to pursue it in sort of real earnest. I have an academic background that is interdisciplinary in nature. I did a PhD in literature and creative writing before moving over more into a focus on affect and media technologies. Um, but the scope and the sites of analysis in the book also speak to this kind of roving nature of my interests, which have moved from testimony and trauma to climate, war, and artificial intelligence. The book is also an attempt to reckon with the intensifying crises in which we live and the demands they place on how we know and who or what gets to know. Our practices of knowledge making are themselves now under pressure, I think, both because the scale of the challenges we face demands new forms of knowing, and because existing frameworks are dissolving in the face of the new pressures applied to them. So I've been interested for some time now in this relationship between the human and the witness, and particularly the implicit notion that the witness is necessarily human, and commensurately, that the human is in part defined by the capacity to witness. There are then, I think, big political questions and big questions about who we are and our place in the world that flow from rethinking witnessing. In the talk today, I'm going to try to avoid quoting too much and referencing too much. But before getting into it, I do want to recognize some of the thinkers who've helped shape my work. On witnessing, in particular, Susan Shupley, Eyal Weizman, Joseph Pugliese, and Kelly Oliver. On affect, Brian Masumi, Erin Manning, and Anna Gibbs. And Brian and Erin's series, Thought in the Act, is the one in which this book appears. I've also been very influenced on war and its violence by Jerris Grove, Antoine Bousquet, and Nisha Shah, particularly at a kind of methodological front and a kind of orientation to how we think about the impact that war has on social, cultural, and political life. I'm also indebted to Sylvia Wynter, Kyle White, Edouard Glissant, Aileen Moulton Robinson, and other thinkers from Black and Indigenous radical traditions, whose work has long put tremendous pressure on the concept of the human and the role of epistemologies in the exercise of colonial and capitalist power, and the necessary rethinking of subjectivity, relationality, and temporality entailed in reckoning with the crises that we in the West have made for ourselves and the planet. So this, then, I think, is an appropriate time to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded and sovereign lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, Australia. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And today, even though I'm mostly going to talk about the colonial present, I want to recognise that colonial histories of control and violence enacted through mundane practices of mapping and registering lands and peoples, as much as through aerial technologies and violence continue to resonate in the systems and technologies that we deal with today. And I also want to acknowledge, just as importantly, the remarkable endurance and resistance of so many Indigenous people here in Australia and around the world. So today I'm going to give you an overview of my new book, Non-Human Witnessing, War, Data and Ecology After the End of the World, which is out now with Duke University Press. I've popped a couple of QR codes on the flyer on the screen, just in case you are particularly interested in the book and want to have a look at picking up a copy. There's a 30% discount with the codes on the screen, and each of those QR codes will take you to two different flyers. One is for people outside North America, which I'm guessing is the vast majority of you, and the other one is for within North America if you happen to be there. So in the talk today, I'm going to try to give an overview of some of the core concepts and propositions of the book, and then illustrate this a little bit with three instances that traverse the book's principal domains of war, data, and ecology. Our planet is now caught within the surge of multiple unfolding and interlocking crises of increasingly autonomous war, algorithmic enclosure, and ecological catastrophe. All crises rooted in the twin historical engines of colonialism and racial capitalism. Advances in machine learning have supercharged both algorithmic enclosure and autonomous war, reliance on mass computing in everything from image recognition to Bitcoin mining has combined with an exponential expansion in digital data stored in servers and trafficked across networks to produce a huge carbon footprint for computation. Built into the bedrock of the civilian internet as the host of everything from ebooks to presidential election campaigns to banking systems, those data infrastructures have a massive environmental impact in heat generated and fossil fuel consumed. Those same fossil fuels, of course, power the energy appetite of the US military, the world's largest carbon polluter, and many others around the world too, of course. In the most basic sense, these crises of war, data, and climate, and the system of racial capitalism they maintain and depend on, are drawing down the finite resources of the planet. Taken together, they are both product and perpetrator of violence, whether structural or infrastructural, environmental or military, algorithmic or interpersonal, kinetic or slow. Crisis also enfolds and consumes events, entangles bodies, intensifies the contexts of their occurrence, and cuts through forms of connection to impose new orders and disorders. My friend and colleague Andrew Murphy calls this catastrophic multiplicity, quote, a complex storm of feeling, of aspects of world feeling each other in intense, unexpected, and constantly mutating ways. Catastrophic multiplicity intensifies, bewilders, and numbs feeling, which makes thinking with and through problems difficult, if not impossible. So crisis doesn't punctuate time so much as shape its passage, lacking any distinct beginning or end, enfolding past and future. So in the book, good timing to put the image back up, the concept of non-human witnessing brings disparate encounters, processes, and scales into conjunction with the relational formation of knowledge and subjectivity. But it does so through committed attention to the processes of mediation that animate and bind together crises of war, data, and climate. Non-human witnessing as a concept describes both a critical tool and a relational practice of a distinct mode of communication, one constituted by an address that demands response, but still embraces opacity. It is a transversal opening onto the workings of violence, experiences of precarity, and the shattering of epistemologies, an aperture through which communication might take place in ways that are necessary for care and justice in the aftermath of ended and ending worlds. Now, witnessing as a concept is fundamental, I think, to cultures, communities, and polities because it pushes events onto the stage of justice, it helps determine significance and truth, contributes to the making of shared knowledge, anchors political subjectivity, and produces responsibility. So witnessing is this really pivotal concept. Witnessing forges relations between witness and event, a registering of something happening that forms an address and insists upon a response. Witnessing and testimony are found in different guises in courtrooms, church halls, human rights tribunals, fiction and poetry, media reports, scientific laboratories, and countless other places, perhaps especially in scholarship. Far from a static or enduring set of practices, though, witnessing itself has transformed throughout Western history, taking on new forms and dynamics alongside and in response to changes in technology, politics, sociality, and religion. So the book asks what happens when the frame of what counts as witnessing expands, how more than human epistemic communities might form, and what this might mean for subjectivity, the nature of justice, and the struggle for more just worlds. So in the book, I developed non-human witnessing as an analytical concept that brings non-human entities and phenomena into the space of witnessing and accords them an agency otherwise denied or limited by witnessing theory to date. This strategic gesture makes room for excluded knowledges, subjectivities, and experiences within a wider framework of cosmopolitical justice. My aim in the book is to unknot witnessing, weave it anew as inescapably entangled with the non-human, and within the warp and weft of that weaving, find a renewed political potential for witnessing after the end of the world. My gambit is that understanding witnessing as bound up with non-human entities and processes provides new and potentially transformative modes of relating to collective crisis and the role of the human within it. deliberately blank. In Western popular culture, apocalypse has been in the air and on the screen and page. Zombies running amok, asteroid strikes, AI takeovers, bioengineered crashes, alien invasions. Metaphors of late capitalism or climate change or global migration, these end times imaginaries are no longer the preserve of niche subcultures or millenarian religions, but at the heart of the most profitable, most mainstream forms of popular culture. But the estrangement felt from those imaginings, the lure of catharsis in the fictional experience of the world, relies on being situated in relation to a specific telling of history. As Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White points out, quote, the hardships many non-Indigenous people dread most of the climate crisis are ones that Indigenous peoples have endured already due to different forms of colonialism: ecosystem collapse, species loss, economic crash, drastic relocation, and cultural disintegration. So now that kind of ending of worlds has come to the world enders, the colonizers and empire builders who imagined into being a singular global world and made it so with the rifle, the slave ship, the ledger, and the plantation. As crises expand, intensify, and intersect, the capacity of witnessing and testimony to respond has been amplified, multiplied, and diversified by the adoption of new and sometimes old technologies, techniques, practices, knowledges, and theories. So we can think of open source investigations led by agencies such as Bellingcat, Airwars, and Forensic Architecture that have shown how crowdsourcing, computational tools, 3D modeling, data analysis, remote sensors, and other technologies and methodologies can be combined with situated testimonies to generate alternative accounts of state and political, state and corporate violence. And Patrick, for example, has done some great work on this. Satellites and drones provide human rights and environmental monitors with rich data that extends and exceeds the perceptual capacity of humans in scale, vantage point, and visibility across a much wider band of the light spectrum. Smartphones and social networks bring a far wider array of voices and images to public attention, shaking the epistemic dominance of traditional media institutions. Cheaper and more accessible sensing technologies have enabled citizen-led projects to monitor local ecologies. Growing recognition within the scientific community about the communicative capacity of plants and ecologies more broadly resonates with the push by First Nations activists to have non-human entities recognized by state law, rivers and mountains, places of country. Artists, poets, activists, and creative practitioners of all stripes now engage with techniques, ecologies, and politics in a testimonial mode that entangles human and non-human actors. In so many contexts, witnessing serves as a socio-technical apparatus that refracts experiment into authority, reportage into truth, science and broadcasting into power, as well as providing these countering opportunities. In the 20th century, a shift took place from transcendental knowledge, continuous media, and analog technologies to mathematical grids and models, discrete media, and statistical technologies. I'm thinking here of computation networks and now especially various kinds of machine learning computation. Enumeration, probability, and statistical inference and analysis take hold, backed by mathematical theories of information and markets. Networked computation applied to a datafied world has produced a new kind of observer, one who followed the rules of the cybernetic order but saw the world through increasingly inhuman modalities of perception. The witness as cyborg, harnessing and harnessed to new technologies of vision, began to shape how data was presented and deployed. But it also signaled a deeper infiltration and extension of human perception and action via machine. This technological transformation laid the foundations for smartphones, drones, remote sensors, and even artificial intelligence to become instruments of witnessing, even as they transform the relationship between witnessing and the ground truth against which it is so often measured. So as I conceive it, non-human witnessing is a way into this messy domain, as both a particular form of perception and something else besides, a communicative form shaped by the materiality and affectivity of the world as medium, an ethico-political mode of relation for grounding anew how meaning comes to matter in the making and remaking of worlds. Non-human witnessing, then, is not intended to be an ahistorical or a transcendental concept, but rather the naming of a set of interconnected practices and processes of witnessing, bound up with evolving epistemic frameworks and forms of mediation. It's intended, then, as a strategic theoretical gesture. Okay, so let's get into some real substance and away from this rapidly moving theory. All right. Future collapse bears down on wounded ecologies in the present, bringing itself into being through the continuance of violence in the form of trauma. Consider, for instance, the fires that have become the norm in California, Brazil, and Australia, and the way their looming ever-presence affects life even beyond the devastating damage to animals, habitats, and homes. There is, in a very real sense, an injury in the now from that which has and yet has not arrived. Always in dynamic flux, even if that flux is entropic, the present of an ecology is always missed in much the same way as it is for humans. Or to put this another way, the present is always lost between unfolding pasts, which carry with them lost futures, and the tug of potential futures. And so too it is in more than human ecologies, in that the present is always unavailable to its own experience. It's always caught between what has been and what is coming. So ecological traumas have shaped and continue to shape lives, communities, cultures, and ecologies. Ecologies are not isolated systems. Any boundaries placed upon them are always artificial and temporary. We distinguish one from another to make them sensible and understandable and researchable, for instance, but ecologies fold into one another, at once one and many. And so among the traumas that have impacted ecologies, there's one that resides at the atomic organization of existence, and that's nuclear war. Nuclear explosions occur within a fraction of a second, but leave radiation that contaminates, mutates, and ends life into unfolding deep time futures. So, Yankunytjatjara elder Lester Yami called it a black mist, a thick black cloud enveloping his country, which is part of a huge swath of Aboriginal land in South Australia used for nuclear testing by Britain from 1953 to 1963. He described his experience this way, quote, "A big bang, a noise like an explosion, and later something come into the air. It was coming from the south, black like smoke. I was thinking it might be a dust storm, but it was quiet, just moving through the trees and above that again, you know? It was just rolling and moving quietly." Nuclear bombs are designed to explode well above the ground, maximizing both the force and radiance of the blast. This is what produces the spectacular mushroom cloud, which reached a height of almost 12 kilometers with the first test at Maralinga in South Australia. Heat is so intense that it turns bodies to ash, melts metal and concrete, and at Maralinga and nearby Emu Fields, transformed the silicate and sand of stretches of desert into a crust of glass. Glass becomes an aesthetic medium for the non-human witnessing of nuclear violence in the hands of the artist Ioannis Scarce. Brittle yet tough, capturing light yet also diffracting and refracting it, rigid when cool yet shaped by the breath of the glassblower when molten. Belonging to the Kokatha and Ngukunu peoples, whose country forms part of the Maralinga exclusion zone, Scarce's personal and familial history is bound to settler colonialism and to its entanglements with nuclear militarism. Her work is intensely political, an unflinching critique of past and present settler violence, but also a celebration of the resilience of Aboriginal people and of country in the face of the colonial logic of elimination. Repeatedly returning to the interconnections between the classification and dispossession of Aboriginal land and scientific and military testing, Scarce's work is unified by an unrelenting aesthetic of austere grayscale, battered found objects, stark medical equipment, and spare architectural structures in installations. While Scarce works with a range of media, glassblowing is at the core of her practice, a visceral and difficult art that demands much of breath and body. So thunder raining poison which is what's up on the screen, and I'm honored to have that on the cover of the book as well. So Thunder Raining Poison and another work, Death Zephyr, which I'll show in a minute, are formally and thematically similar works. They're both composed of thousands of blown glass yams suspended from the ceiling in arrays that reference the atmospheric forms produced by nuclear tests at Maralinga. There are critical differences between the two works. Thunder Raining Poison captures the instance of detonation, yams arranged in a teardrop formation and mostly made of clear glass. Death Zephyr, this one, examines the spread of contaminated particles in the aftermath of the blast, its mix of black and clear yams hanging in a swirling current, a material enactment of Lester Yami's Black Mist over country. Composing yams into forms of nuclear explosion and dispersal materializes the violation of life by such violence. It's assault on the non-human that sustains the human. Not only is sand blasted into non-life, these works suggest, but also the means to sustain life, affectively and discursively signified in the alchemy of yams, becomes inedible. Glass food. These are reminders of the limits of the forensic practices of the state to understand the consequences of the tests conducted on Aboriginal land. Precisely because life is a rich ecology, yams, sand, land, bush, animals, people, they're all bound together by country, a relationality that is just as crucial to the ecology as the electromagnetic forces that hold neutrons in check are to stability at the atomic scale. Through the breath of the glassblower, vitrified silica becomes intimate and lively, a rich ecology of country, life, fruit, vegetable, and yet still an ecology deeply wounded by the violence of war and settlement. Glass yams and bush plums distill the ecological traumas of nuclear testing at Maralinga, the stuff of life rearranged into the mushroom cloud. Life, in all its relations, located in country and food, in air and stone and water, is not simply, I think, indexed or represented in the art of Ioannis Scarce. It is processually present, present as process, materialized as a witnessing ecology come to life out of the urgent need to witness ecological trauma and its continued imbrication with the settler state and its militarisms. Its capture of breath, of course, references nuclear histories, but it also orients towards the present of settler governance and towards the unfurling of history and its necessary futurity. So from glass art to weapons targeting. Agile Condor is an onboard targeting system for military drones developed by the defense firm SRC Inc. in collaboration with the US Air Force Research Laboratory. Built to analyze large quantities of data from the drone's sensor apparatus in real time, Agile Condor is embedded in a pod that can be fitted to the wing of an MQ-9 Reaper, the principal weaponized drone in the United States arsenal. According to its makers, Agile Condor is an artificial intelligence targeting system capable of analyzing video footage, synthetic aperture radar imagery, or infrared camera imagery in order to detect, categorize, prioritize, and track potential targets. By undertaking a whole lot of image processing autonomously at the edge of the network, Agile Condor only sends imagery it deems to meet a threshold of value to human analysis back to people, which cuts down latency and relieves pressure from overstretched military networks. Agile Condor and technologies like it, though, raise big questions around how and where computational knowledge gets made and how war can be witnessed in an age of increasingly autonomous weaponry. Where does the witnessing happen if the image in the scene is already being interpreted by a machine learning system? And in turn, this has implications for knowledge making more generally, I think, not least because war, for all its violence, is a creative domain of continual becoming that exerts a kind of remarkable pull on the fabric of cultural political life, and indeed on the project of technoscience more generally. So Agile Condor is worthy of attention, I think, because it integrates autonomous perception into an already complex kill chain, inserting a machinic intelligence that preemptively shapes the fields of possibility for human analysts and operators. Agile Condor constitutes a kind of liminal non-human witness. It predetermines the meaning and significance of objects and events, presenting them as open to address by the remote warfare system. Through the operative role of its onboard high-performance computer, this AI pod siphons off human agency in the name of efficiency. No longer will human analysts be concerned with discerning the figure of threat, the target of violence, against the ground of life, but only with an array of figures presented as potentially actionable by a machine. President of Weapons Manufacturer General Atomics, David R. Alexander, claims that Agile Condor's, quote, ability to autonomously fuse and interpret sensor data to determine targets of interest is at the forefront of unmanned systems technology. But edge computing like this is not confined to military applications, and in fact, it originates in commercial problems of bandwidth and latency produced by the move towards cloud computing architectures. So against the push to centralize control via the capacity of networks to distribute information, edge computing offers the potential to decentralize control while retaining centralized authority, to decentralize decision. In war, this fusion of sensing, classifying, and selecting within black box technologies signals an increasing acceptance of computational agencies on and above the battlefield. Where the military media technologies of the 20th century shaped and were shaped by mass, those of the 21st are devolved, individual, and distributed. According to both its marketing material and various technical papers, Agile Condor uses a neuromorphic architecture modeled on human neural systems. And in other words, its capacity for discriminating perception is intended to mimic neurobiology, in contrast to the typical parallel processing architecture in the machine learning systems that we're most likely more familiar with. So these neuromorphic systems use, in this case, something called a spiking neural network architecture, which is designed so that individual neurons within the system are supposed to fire independently and directly change the states of other neurons when differences between images are detected. The idea here is that because the information about what's happening in images is actually coded directly into the signals within the machine learning system, the spiking networks are not limited to binary states like 1, 0, 1, 0, but can thus produce something closer to the analog workings of the brain, more proximate to the early cybernetic dream before it veered towards an altogether different computational rationality. Whether this actually works remains debatable, of course, but the premise points to a kind of emergent computational tendency that doesn't necessarily align with how we typically think about the way these systems work. Non-human, but verging and veering into the human. As with so much emergent military technology, exactly how Agile Condor might operate has to be gleaned via various snippets of insight about the computational architecture and machine learning techniques used in the system. So there's a bunch of technical papers published by the research team that give some indication about how they work, but these leave us with a whole host of questions. With many of these foreclosed about exactly how the system operates and how it's used and what data it's trained on and so on, we can turn instead to the promotional materials for an articulation of the military imaginary that animates Agile Condor. So, in a 2-minute video produced by SRC Inc., Agile Condor is presented as a powerful tool for saving lives and preventing violence. So rendered in the video game graphics you're seeing on the screen, a General Atomics Reaper drone takes off from a mountainous Air Force base. Cruising at night above a dense urban environment, its sensor system identifies various objects, marking them with glowing green squares. Then Agile Condor kicks in, automatically analyzing incoming imagery, dramatized as a cliched array of image feeds entering the hardened box of the computer itself and headlined in multiple places with the term neuromorphic computing. The Agile Condor swiftly does its magic and an alert flashes. Threat detected. We cut to a swarthy figure with an RPG on his shoulder and a convoy of vehicles and back to the aerial view. Now the convoy vehicles are marked in blue and the threat in red. The sensor pulls focus onto the threat and zooms in tight, resolving a high-resolution image that it then runs through a facial recognition system to obtain a 98% match. The convoy, as we'll see, can be diverted, and helicopters sent to arrest the would-be assailant. Sensor capture, image analysis, threat determination, geolocation, signals transfer, and operational actualization are all presented as seamless, frictionless processes, with much of the computational work undertaken at the edge of the network, beyond the limits of human perception. Agile Condor, I think, points to the existence of a non-human witnessing operating exclusively within an algorithmic domain inaccessible to the human. This non-human witnessing occurs alongside the preemptive determinations that the system makes, diffracted through the hunt for emergent threat and within the loop of sensor capture and algorithmic identification, classification, filtering, and prioritizing. This mode of relation to the event probes the limits of witnessing. Within the broader milieu of drone warfare, any witnessing that occurs within the Agile Condor system needs to be understood in relation to its consequences for the witnessing that takes place within the wider military apparatus, alongside and with its human actors. If preemptive technologies such as Agile Condor seek to cut through the inefficiencies of symbolic narrative and causal analysis, they also undo the grounds of evidence itself by presenting the potential need for action through an operative frame detached from the complexities of the world beyond the sensor. In this sense, the machinic witnessing at work within the technical constellation of Agile Condor pod, sensor array, and aerial drone constitutes a kind of witnessing without evidence. For the human operators, analysts, and commanders looped into such cybernetic control systems to varying degrees of intimacy, witnessing is already mediated by the preemptive shaping and techno-authority of the targeting system. For those operators seeing war through the machinic eye of automated imaging and analysis systems, witnessing drone violence is inescapably human. Not only because the apparatus mediates what is captured by its sensors, but also because human witnessing is already preemptively entangled within the machine vision of Agile Condor. Third instance. Our third instance of non-human witnessing can be found in the forensic architecture project, Triple Chaser. Founded in 2010 by architect and academic Isle Weitzman and located at Goldsmiths, forensic architecture invents investigative techniques using spatial, architectural, and situated methods. And presented at the 2019 Whitney Biennale in New York, Triple Chaser combines photographic images and video with synthetically generated media to develop a data set for a deep learning neural network able to recognize tear gas canisters. These tear gas canisters have been used against civilians around the world, and they were manufactured by Safariland, a company owned by then board member of the Whitney Museum, Warren Kanders. So in keeping with the established ethos of forensic architecture, Triple Chaser demonstrates how forensics, a practice typically and heavily associated with both policing and the law, can be turned against the very state agencies that typically deploy its gaze. As Joseph Pugliese points out, quote, embedded in the concept of forensics is a combination of rhetorical, performative, and narratological techniques that can, in fact, be deployed outside courts of law. So for Isle Weitzman, this fora of forensics is critical. There needs to be a public place in which the fora of forensics comes to matter. It brings evidence into the domain of contestation in which politics happens. So in the forensic architecture's counter-forensic investigation, tear gas deployed by police and security agencies becomes the subject of interrogation and representation to the public. In this making public, distinctions and overlaps can be traced between different modes of knowledge making and address, the production of evidence, the speaking of testimony, and the witnessing of the audience. But how might we understand the role of the machine learning algorithm itself? And how are we to conceptualize this synthetic evidence? Testimony can, of course, be entered into evidence, but something more fundamental is at work in Triple Chaser, I think. Its machine learning model doesn't simply register or represent, it's operative, generating relations between objects in the world and the parameters of its data. Its technical assemblage precedes both evidence and testimony. It comes before. It engages in a non-human witnessing before anything human comes along. So as development commenced, Triple Chaser faced a challenge. Forensic architecture was only able to source a very small percentage of the thousands of images needed to train a machine learning algorithm to recognize the tear gas canisters produced by Safariland. They were, however, able to source detailed video footage of depleted canisters from activists and even obtain some material fragments. Then, borrowing strategies from used by Microsoft, NVIDIA, and others, this data could be modeled into 3D models of the canisters and then put into the Unreal gaming engine and then scripted to output thousands of different canister images against backgrounds ranging from abstract patterns to simulated real-world contexts. Tagging of these natively digital objects also sidestepped the labor and error of doing this by hand, allowing a training set to be built swiftly from images created with their metadata attached. Using several different machine learning techniques, forensic architecture were able to train a neural network to identify Safariland tear gas canisters from a partial image with a high degree of accuracy and with weighted probabilities. These synthetic evidence assemblages then thus taught the algorithm how to witness. Like most image recognition systems, Triple Chaser deploys a convolutional neural network, or a CNN, which learns to spatially analyze the pixels of an image. Trained on tagged datasets, CNN slide or convolve a series of filters across the surface of an image to produce activation maps that allow the algorithm to iteratively learn about the spatial arrangement of pixels, which can be repeated across large sets of images. There's going to be some flashing on the screen in a moment, by the way, just in case that will bother you. These activation maps are passed from one convolutional layer to the next, with various techniques applied to increase accuracy and prevent the spatial scale of the system from going out of control. Exactly what happens within each convolutional layer remains in the algorithmic unknown. It cannot be distilled into representational form, but rather eludes cognition. Machine learning processes thus exhibit a kind of autonomic affective capacity to form relations between objects and build schemas for action from the modulation and mapping of those relations. Relations between elements vary in intensity, with the process of learning both producing and identifying intensities that are autonomous from the elements themselves. It is precisely this that cannot be visualized or cognized. Intensive relations assemble elements into new aggregations. Digital bodies of code affect and are affected by other bodies. This is an autonomic quality to such algorithmic knowledge making. It's more affective, more relational than it is cognitive. This machinic registering of relations accumulates to make legible, otherwise unknown connections between sensory data, and it does so with the potential, if not the intention, for that registering to make political claims, to function as a kind of witnessing of what might otherwise go undetected. Of course, in Triple Chaser, the politics is front and center. But as Triple Chaser demonstrates, algorithmic witnessing troubles both relations between witness and evidence and those between witnessing and event. This machine learning system, trained to witness via synthetic data, suggests that the linear temporal relation in which evidence, the photograph, the fragment of tear gas canister, the temporal relation in which evidence is interpreted by the human witness cannot or need not hold. Through their capacities for recognition and discrimination, non-human agencies of the machinic system enact the witnessing that turns the trace of events into evidence. Witnessing, in this sense, is a kind of relational diagram that makes possible the composition of relations that in turn assemble into objects that can be experienced. If witnessing precedes both witness and evidence, then witnessing, in this sense, forges the witness rather than the figure of the witness, granting witnessing its legitimacy and standing. So non-human witnessing then elevates the status of the other than human in bearing witness, refiguring witnessing as the entanglement of human and non-human entities in the making of knowledge claims. Non-human witnessing can be identified in ecological, biological, geological, and even chemical manifestations. but also, as I've shown, in technical and aesthetic forms, such as drone sensor assemblages and machine learning algorithms and glass blowing. This means that non-human witnessing is inseparable from place, time, media, context, and the other human and non-human bodies through and alongside which it takes place. Against the singular world of the scientific or juridical witness inherited from the Enlightenment, non-human witnessing coheres with what Mario Blazer and Marisol Della Cadena call a world of many worlds. Upending the long history in theory and philosophy of reserving witnessing for the human subject, my provocation in this talk, and especially in the book, is that witnessing is and always has been non-human. Our contemporary conjuncture makes this much easier to see, precisely because so much of Western ontology and epistemology has been thrown into crisis. If crises of autonomous war, algorithmic enclosure, and environmental catastrophe are indeed converging in the contemporary moment, it is surely in no small part because their roots reach so deep into the historical grounds of militarism, capitalism, and colonialism. Non-human witnessing thus provides purchase on unfolding catastrophic futures, but also on the catastrophes of the past, and on the potential, I think, for radical hope, historical acts of resistance, and the making and remaking of more just worlds. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Michael. That was really a great talk and such a rich presentation and a wonderful book. I think I'll just maybe when people are kind of thinking through questions. Oh, actually, I can see Bernadette's got a hand up. So Bernadette, I mean, we can jump straight into your question if you want, and if others people want to kind of jump in as well, then you can feel free to raise your hands as well. But please, Bernadette, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for that wonderful talk, Michael. I look forward to reading your book, and I suspect that you've done a brilliant job of just condensing a lot of very tricky material into a short talk. So that's really incredible. Thank you. I want to ask you two questions, actually. The first one is to do with the use of this term non-human. I was a little bit concerned about the use of that as the title, really, because what you say in the substance of the talk suggests something that is more complicated than a kind of binary opposition between human and non-human. I mean, you talk about how witnessing forges the witness and how the human witness is entangled in these apparently non-human domains. And so I wanted to ask you why you plumped for that term, because those of us, I guess, who have been raised in a Deleuzian kind of, theoretical context, which of course Masumi is, and many of the others that you mentioned, are inclined to think more about the entanglement, which means that any sharp lines between the end of the human and the beginning of the non-human are actually difficult to discern. So that's my first question as to why you plump for that term. The second question, I guess, has more to do with your background, which you haven't really talked much about in literary studies, because it seems to me that, reading someone like Catherine Hale, for instance, or, these thinkers who are very concerned with the production of imagine of a technological imagination, for instance, where the deep concerns within science that and the imagination within science that has driven science itself. And I'm thinking here about the images that you use, the military images that you use, for instance, which depicts war technology as being kind of all-powerful. And this is a sort of myth that actually has been around for a very long time. and that is constantly punctured by what we actually see in real war, as it were. I mean, today, if you're in the UK, the first thing you'll have heard on the news this morning is the test firing of a Trident missile from the Royal Navy has failed, and it's failed for the second time in a row. And this kind of evidence is very much at odds with the story about military might that is constantly presented and has constantly been presented by military industrial complexes around the world for a very long time. I mean, going back to Vietnam, we know now that the reason that military strategists in Vietnam could not foresee their defeat in Vietnam was simply because of the faith that they had in systems analysis produced by Rand Corporation, produced by Humbro. We had then the beginnings of these autonomous warfare systems, which supposedly would instruct soldiers in helicopters to fire at targets that would not be selected by humans. And of course, the fact that these turned out to be bad, poor, not smart, all of these things was simply ignored by military strategists for a long time. We live in a time where, the supposed end of this kind of military strategy and the military sublime was never supposed to end up in trench warfare in Ukraine. So, that's my second question, really, is to do with the kind of mismatch between these stories of all-seeing machine systems where humans are increasingly sidelined and the absolute kind of reality that we see all of the time in contemporary military conduct, which is very far removed from these all-seeing, all-powerful autonomous systems. And I should just say that I'm based at Goldsmiths myself, and I run the Art and Politics MA there.
Thanks, Bernadette. Great question. On the why the non-human, there are reams of text on the cutting room floor of this book about wrestling back and forth with various terms. And there's a bit in the book about, there's a bit left in the book about it, but there's two answers. One is that I'm uncomfortable with the post-human as a framing, which is one that gets bandied around in part because it presumes a humanity of that which one can be post of, there's some really great critiques of that framing. Like I'm thinking Zakiya Iman-Jackson, for example, has a really excellent critique of like, well, what does it mean to insist on a beyond the human if there are people still who are refused that category to begin with? So that sort of made me uncomfortable with that language. More than human, inhuman, other ways of talking about things that might sort of emphasize the relationality a bit more were very tempting. In part, I fell on this one because I think there's a really good account in Richard Brewson's edited collection, The Non-Human Turn, where he sort of says that he talks about the human and the non-human sort of necessitating one another and not being separable from one another. So I kind of use the term, I don't know, like for me, it ends up being a good enough place, a good enough frame to offer rather than like something I'm committed to because of a binary distinction. So even though the term sort of seems to summon that binary, I hope the way I use it in the book doesn't doesn't do that. And the reason I went with that more, and the final reason is that like more than human with two hyphens felt like something I couldn't write 1,000 times or several hundred times into a book. And so I just went, you know what, I'm just going to bite the bullet and go with non-human. But you're not the first to ask that question, and I spent a long time asking that question myself. Um, on the other side, there's a lot in your question, the remainder of your question. Um, I mean, like a lot of my work is situated in this tension actually between the incapacities of technologies and of military claims to deliver upon themselves and the tension between the promise or the claim or the imaginary and the actuality of their implementation. Um, you know, for like, and that disjuncture, that separation is, of course, like part of the work of military propaganda and knowledge making today, is to assert the non-existence of that fact of failure. So, it's embarrassing when test flights or Trident tests have to be declared inaccurate. But of the many thousands of drone strikes that the United States launched in Afghanistan and the federated tribal areas of Pakistan post 9/11, that the default position of all of them was that they were accurate and that they killed who they were meant to kill, in no small part because anyone they killed was presumed to be a military-aged male unless proven otherwise, right? And so, this problem of the claims made about the thing and its actuality, I think is something that's really important. And I think I can't remember how much I explicitly discussed that in the book, but like the example of the Agile Condor that I talked about today, in part, like what's amazing about it is that there's just like kind of so much nonsense. There's actually so little there, and yet it's proposing a relation, right? It's proposing a transformation of martial epistemology or of the way we make knowledge about war. So I think like I think that tension's really important to kind of get into, but you're absolutely right about the importance of not losing sight of the actuality. And the examples you gave of Vietnam and systems analysis and so on are really good ones. And like in some other work that I'm doing with collaborator Zoe Horn, where we've been looking at claims around new digital twin technologies, and often they like harken back to exactly the same those systems analysis ideas from the Vietnam War, even though those have been incredibly influential in business in the corporate world and so on, even though they were like so thoroughly horrific in their consequences in Vietnam. So, I think these tensions around epistemic frames are really important to wrestle with. I hope that sort of gets out a little bit. Yeah, I do have just on the background thing, I have a kind of a bit of an eclectic academic background with some literary studies and some international politics and war studies and security studies and stuff. So I bundled together a whole bunch of stuff more generally in my work. But yeah, there was enough packed into that talk maybe that more would have been a little perilous.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. And I look forward to reading more in detail.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bernadette. Johan, do you have a question? Feel free to.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Michael, for this very insightful talk. Ever since reading the introduction to your book, I can't help but wonder how to connect your understanding of non-human witnessing to film studies. And coming into this book presentation, I was thinking about asking this question, but now having heard your talk and especially having seen this clip of Agile Condor, I'm actually wondering about something else, and that's it's quite widely accepted in film studies that films or film as a medium is also kind of a mirror of the society wherein it is produced. We have the understanding that even a non-documentary film serves as a document of the times in which it was produced and so on. And so now I'm wondering, and I know this might be a bit of a stretch, but the clip of Agile Condor in and of itself, does it also engage in a sense of non-human witnessing? Can we attest a sense of non-human witnessing to this clip? Because I feel like, and I don't know, I didn't do any research on Agile Condor, but just based on the clip that we've seen, it also, in a way, reacts and mediates the trauma of urban warfare and the trauma of IUDs and so on. And so, yeah, this making me wonder, do we see, apart from non-human witnessing in film and in such clips, also film and such clips as engaging in non-human witnessing?
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Johan. These clips are incredible because like kind of to sort of connecting back to what Bernadette was saying before, they really enact this like just hyperbolic imaginary of these systems, but I think they're fascinating because they're really revealing. And this is like a whole genre, right? You can like troll YouTube and look at thousands of these different things, and they almost always have the same like expensive but not that expensive computer graphics, like and a very kind of video game first person shooter style environments that like feel like cutscenes from Call of Duty or something like that. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that I don't have a good answer to is like where one draws the line about what constitutes witnessing and what does not. I think it's a really difficult question actually, and it's maybe one that like we apply after the fact rather than in the moment. We make that determination after the fact, and so you know what becomes in the after. An instance of witnessing, a registering that entails witnessing is might be unexpected, right? Whereas some things in their occurrence, we immediately know that they hold this sort of like ethico-political force. They matter to have been there, to have seen them, for them to be recorded on a digital device or whatever it might be, right? I think that clips like this one are interesting because of the way they're being generated and what they're being and how they're being done. So, you know, they're using computer graphics to do all of these things. They're undertaking kinds of coding and so on in the process of making them, and they depend upon tiny slivers of the computational power and energy use and so on that I mentioned towards the top of the talk. And so there's ways in which like their materiality, their medial quality, their processes of mediation entail some of these witnessing dynamics, perhaps like as sort of non-human registrations. But then, yeah, perhaps like it's a question to ask about the nature of the medium, you know, like the computer graphics medium is one way to think about that, to consider it to be uh, engaged in a non-human witnessing, like an image such as a moving image such as this. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I certainly think that film, you know, to come to the question that you came with, the yeah, I think film is often doing precisely this, actually, in that in the non-human witnessing, in that like the capturing of the world into the technical media apparatus of the film camera, whether that is like an analog film camera in which like light is being burnt into celluloid, or whether it is a digital camera in which like, you know, tens of thousands of little sensors are capturing transitions in light and refracting those into code in various ways. Like that, there is this like process of registration going on, and then then film is being assembled often into something that is intended to like make a claim upon the world, to like, assert the meaning of something, to tell us something about people or events or whatever. Particularly documentary, of course, can operate in this mode. So yeah, I mean, I think yes. One of the texts that really helped me in thinking about the nature of media in the context of the book is Sean Cubitt's Finite Media. And if you've read the book, like it opens with this account of the film of the true history of the Kelly gang, not the true history of the Kelly gang, the history of the Kelly gang, the really old Australian celluloid film, and the way in which that film, the physical film, is decaying. And there's these efforts using computer systems and stuff to restore it and replace it, and bring in place of the decaying film object like a digital version of the film. And the question of like what does it mean to capture it in its fidelity or not capture it in its fidelity is a really complex one. But the decay of the film is actually also shows us the finitude of media and registers like this movement of time. It constant, in my sense, it would like, Cubitt is not making this argument. He's making an argument about the finite nature of media. But to me, like, I think if we take it along the axis of my book, it would be that like here we're looking at like the registering of time, like a non-human witnessing of chemical transformation, of decomposition, and so on, that we encounter in that transformation of media and its capacity to signify, and its capacity to affect, and so on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. So we've got a question from Anat in the chat, so I can read that out for you, Michael. So thank you for the brilliant talk. With regards to the example of Agile Condor, why witnessing rather than surveillance? Is the difference only in the context/forum? Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Nat. That's a great question. I think, quite clearly what's being proposed here is like a very operative form of surveillance, and potentially what Catherine Hall calls lethal surveillance. Like this is surveillance with a certain kind of intentionality. It is proposing the potential to enact violence, whether in the name of preventing violence or immediate violence, or against some sort of emergent threat down the line. So it certainly is surveillance. But I also think like the surveiller can also be a witness. And I think like one of the things that has interested me for a long time, like, all the way through my work, is sort of the position of the perpetrator as witness. And that we need to hold both of these things, that like what is going on through Agile Condor is of course surveillance. And yet I think, or my proposition is that at least in the way that this machine learning system is registering things about the world and already attaching significance, and not just significance of any kind, but significance of the potential need for the violent action. And so there is this like the thing is already operating, I think, in the domain of the ethical and moral. It is already registering things in the world in a way that are making an ethical and political claim, which I think is like core to what witnessing is. So absolutely, yes, surveillance. But there is something within inside that, I think, where there is a witnessing taking place. Now, one of the things I think that's complicated in a system like this, and it could be Agile Condor, but it could be any number of similar kind of automated systems of computer vision and differentiation and target selection or object identification or whatever, that they're not always going to lead to a human engaging and thinking and taking up the question of whether witnessing is occurring here and providing a kind of and providing a kind of human testimony. Quite often, this non-human or more than human or whatever technology is going to be where the witnessing and registering happens, and the human engagement with that will only ever be partial. And so, yes, surveillance, but I want to pick out a particular kind of registering and a particular mode of communication and communicative potential within that. And I like these examples of like the book's got lots of examples that are not, you know, like terrible weapons that could do really bad things. But I do like to sort of bring this in to sort of assert the always present ambivalence, I think, of the witness. To witness is not necessarily to act on behalf of justice at all, actually.
Great, thank you, Michael. Tanya's got a brief kind of comment that I'll read out. So thank you for your wonderful talk, Michael. I'm doing some research on AI facilitated abuse and deepfakes, and look forward to reading your book. And then Julio with a question here. Hi, Michael. Thank you for this rich and wonderful presentation. I'm currently reading your book, and I feel that what you are foregrounding is a strong sense of relationality that happens between human and non-human in the process of witnessing itself, compared to Shipley's account of material witness that has more of an ontological take. You argue instead for a constant movement between human and non-human through the activation of one and or of the other in their kind of mutual relation. So I ask you then, what is the forum or the places where this non-human witnessing can actually occur, other than courts, like in your ecological instance? Might it be the museum?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Look, I think like Susan Shipley's Material Witness book is fantastic. And I loved reading it, and I have huge admiration for her work and both like what she's contributed to at forensic architecture, but also and especially actually in the work she's done around that. I really sort of I think that's broadly right. I think in the sense that like I think Susan Shipley's got more of a ontological take on the status of the witness, but also kind of insists on contestability, and that's the sort of significance of the forum, right? That the forum in which one bears witness, in which evidence is brought forward, and if the evidence itself cannot speak, that there is an expert there to speak on its behalf if needed, but that like certain forms of material evidence will in fact speak for themselves or bear material witness. I think this is like I think she and I are interested in very similar things, but I think interested in a different moment, perhaps, where like for Shipley, it's this like the forum and the contestability is really important, because I think often what she's talking about is like the bearing of witness and the status of the witness. So, I use the term non-human witnessing rather than non-human witness, because I really want to maintain the focus in the book and around the event of occurrence, the registering of phenomena, the moments of mediation, the ruptures and the acts of violence, and the material, affective, discursive, linguistic, embodied, technical, et cetera, impacts that has before this demand to speak, the demand to bear witness. So if we kind of break up the kind of it's sort of breaking up the temporality of witnessing, witness, bearing witness, production of testimony, and thinking with that like sort of first component. So, I don't have like a really good answer about which one's right, because I don't think that they're at odds in a really radical way. I think we're just kind of interested in different things. And in Al Weizman and Matt Fuller's book on investigative aesthetics, where they're interested in aesthesis and aesthetics as a kind of mode of sensing and sense making, I think that is them getting into this space as well and trying to kind of wrestle with that. And so I think it kind of conceptually, we're all sort of interested in a similar set of questions, but we're kind of pursuing them along different trajectories. And so I hope, if Susan reads it, I hope she'll find that a value. In terms of the forum of where a non-human witnessing can take place, I mean, I think it happens in courts, right? And I think it happens often, actually, in courts, where evidence does more than just sit there, and evidence does more than exist subject to the interpretation of the expert witness, or the lawyer or whoever who connects up the evidence. So I think a non-human witnessing can take place in courts, but I think that we're invited to encounters with it in loads of different places. Galleries is one, but it might be in encounters with ecological sites, etc. But I think crucially, like in my work, I'm kind of wanting to take a step before how something becomes exhibited or placed in a fora, and instead ask, well, what is the registering that's going on, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Michael. Bernadette, please.
Thank you. Thanks for indulging me with the opportunity to ask another question. I appreciate it. But actually, Michael, you anticipated it in your answer there in that question, because what I wanted to ask you, what I was thinking of in my head as you were answering, was precisely to do with this term aesthetics and where it features in your book, if at all, because I also obviously have read investigative aesthetics, and it's a curious an interesting term, which kind of epitomizes this tension between the human and the non-human as well, in that sensing and sense making involve a tension with each other. And Al and Matt, in that, contemplate that kind of space in which aestheticization is dialogic and collective and relational, and is something that encompasses individuals, but then also operates at a level beyond individuals. And I just wondered, for you, if you also had grappled with that term aesthetics in relation to the non-human, and if so, where you had sort of come down on in that conversation.
I mean, I'm pretty, like, conceptually and politically, I'm pretty much with Isle and Matt from that book. Like, I find that account of aesthetics quite persuasive, and it's the one I do use in the book. And I think it's an introduction. I do also sort of make the case for aesthetics broadly as sensing, as the sort of conjoined dual process of sensing and sense making, but also aesthetics in the sort of sense of the aesthetic object, or artistic object as sort of important sites through which we can engage with this with witnessing and with the non-human and so on. And I think a really interesting question for me, and it's not sort of fully answered in the book really, but maybe in some other work that I've got coming out, gets it a little bit more, is to sort of think about that, how aesthetics in that sense, in that sort of broad and powerful sense that Weizman and Fuller have, it connects up with Rancière's account of aesthetics as the distribution of the sensible, and who gets to decide what the aesthetic object is. Now, in Rancière's work, what he's meaning by aesthetics, I think, is different, right? But nevertheless, I think it prompts us to kind of go, well, like how do we determine what counts as aesthetic and what doesn't, and how does that then connect with aesthetics as a process of sensing and sense making. But yeah, I have no I'm very on board with that account of aesthetics, and it's actually the one that I draw on the most in my work and teaching and so on.
Okay, thank you.
So if there's, feel free if there's any other kind of questions percolating in people's minds, do either drop them in the chat or raise your hand. Perhaps I'll just take this opportunity to ask you a question as well, Michael. And I guess it's very broadly to do with kind of the question of temporality. So kind of in the book's introduction, you argue that crisis should be viewed not as a kind of departure from order, but as a kind of fundamental aspect of existence. So characterized by kind of fragmentation rather than rupture.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a persistent state, not a fleeting event. And then obviously that kind of challenges this idea of crisis as a kind of exceptional state, instead emphasizing its kind of pervasive and uneven distribution. So I was struck here firstly by kind of resonances. I guess this is more of like a observation, and then the question comes afterwards. But I was struck here with resonances with Povinelli's concepts of kind of quasi events and dispersed suffering. So that is suffering which is, quote, kind of ordinary, chronic, cruddy, rather than catastrophic, crisis laden and sublime, a quiet form of abjection, despair, or impoverishment. And she asks then, how does one kind of construct an ethics in relation to this kind of dispersed suffering? And I think the work of your book really, and the kind of the concept of non-human witnessing you put forward really seems to kind of actually respond in kind of direct ways actually to Povinelli's provocation. So I guess building from that, one of the potential criticisms that I guess I've slowly been kind of putting forward or thinking through, in relation to much of the work of kind of media forensics, and this is a kind of expanding field of investigation, is often, and I think this is less true of forensic architecture, but more true of a range of other groups within that kind of sphere. They seem to kind of get stuck with a conception of crisis as that kind of rupture, right? As a particular kind of moment. There seems to be a kind of temporal limitation to these modes of investigative work. Quite often, they respond to moments of violence that are usually kind of short and episodic. So I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about the kind of the importance then of kind of folding in or infolding longer temporalities into your conception of non-human witnessing, and how it kind of marks then a departure from these kind of traditional understandings of crisis that are focused very much on moments of short episodic moments of kind of rupture or catastrophe.
Thanks. That's a great question. I've read a fair bit of Povinelli, but the quasi-crisis stuff is not springing to mind at the moment, so I'll have to go back and have a look. But that what you've just described seems to connect up with quite well with what Lauren Ballant called in their book Cruel Optimism, the crisis ordinariness of life. And I think like a good question. I think there's a good question is like, when have we not been in crisis? Might be a starting point. And when we say we, who do we mean? Because like the persistence of a normality or of an evenness or of a stability often comes at the expense of crisis elsewhere or for others. This is in some ways a refraction of the quote from Kyle White that I put up towards the top of the talk about how like that many of the experiences that people in the West and around the world are experiencing today and thinking of as like novel and new are things that that Indigenous peoples and other colonized peoples and other peoples in general have experienced for a very long time. And I'm sure like there in Northern England, you could think of versions of that, right, that are like very much like that have taken place in England. So it's not exclusive to the reaches of empire. Um, I think I think that like I think that on the one hand, thinking of crisis as narrowly temporal, like crisis erupts, is resolved or fades away or drops in importance and then goes into the background, and that all that happens in a relatively short order. I don't think that's helpful, at least at the kind of critical theoretical level, although I understand why for an organization like Bellingcat, for example, it would want to be articulating a significant crisis into in Ukraine, for example, because this like raises the stakes and asserts the value of the work that's going on. And that's important actually for funding and attention and all of those kinds of things. So there's a sort of strategic importance in sort of asserting crisis as in that particular form. But I don't think that's helpful in the larger sort of political milieu and the larger question of like how do we think about the nature of crisis. At the same time, I think simply saying we live in like endless and ongoing crisis that's like undifferentiated except by the like fact of fragmentation and dislocation and alienation and so on. I also think that's risky too, because then it suggests like a temporal flatness, which is also, I think, not helpful. So, if we want to talk, for example, about the kind of period of like economic crisis that has operated in the Anglosphere and elsewhere, but in the Anglosphere since 2008, for example, and the global financial crash. We could argue that we continue to live within the scope of that crisis, and that crisis in turn like folds back quite readily into earlier ones around in the 80s or the oil shocks of the 70s or whatever it might be. And holding on to those temporalities and accepting that like recognizing periodization of crisis as political and strategic, I think is important. I think one of the things that for me is helpful about thinking about non-human witnessing in the context of crisis is that I hope it opens up a way of considering the temporality and the effect and the texture of crisis in ways that do not necessitate that we go back to a human experience of time by default, or that we kind of like situate crisis within like the sort of political media milieu of a particular moment, because, and I think like, nuclear testing, nuclear warfare, and so on are crises with this like long tail of temporality. In Maralinga in South Australia, the Adamanyatha country that I talked about which was blasted by the nuclear tests, and where the black cloud moved across moved across country. The land is still like contaminated in many ways, and cleanup efforts have failed, or they've been abandoned because they're too expensive. And like that too expensive question is like also one about the nature of crisis and who bears its brunt, and crisis for whom. Like nuclear testing at Maralinga is like not a crisis for the Australian government in 2024. It was a crisis for the Australian government in the 1980s when there were royal commissions into that. Cleanup efforts and stuff were kicked off. As those became expensive and ineffective and like doing more would cost more, et cetera, the urgency of that crisis was gone from the governmental perspective, right? But like it's endured for like the people of those lands. continues to right now, higher cancer rates, different ecologies, transformed land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for the ecology will hold, like the marker will continue to register and bear witness to that crisis for a huge amount of time as radioactive isotopes like decay in half-life after half-life. And so I think that we need some conceptual ways to connect up those different temporalities and to think about them in the frame of the political. And there's lots of ways to do that, right? I'm hoping, I hope that the work I've been doing offers one, and one within a particular kind of way of thinking about knowledge and about meaning and about politics and what it demands. Because I mean, part of I won't kind of go into it in detail, but sort of the sort of end of the book is sort of attempts to ask, well, so what? Like, what do we do with this? And sort of tries to reckon with the need for living on a planet in a world in which like many modes of knowing and being are possible, and they don't need to be reducible or transparent to one another, but they can produce their own forms of knowing and yet hold the potential for frictions and crossovers and transversal understandings and stuff taking place, and yet not being necessitated upon like full disclosure or the recognition of an abstract and universal knowledge system like technoscience, for example, which would claim the potential to know all.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant, brilliant response that really got to the heart of my question. Bernadette, please.
Me again. Thank you so much for letting me back in.
We're gonna need to go for like a coffee or
I know,
maybe a pint.
Absolutely. Yeah, my question actually bears directly on that last reply, and it seemed to me as though what you're describing here is not unlike Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence.
Right.
And I wondered why the term violence has been missing so far from the discussion. One of my bugbears when it comes to discussions about violence is that we tend to singularize it when it isn't an it at all, and when it is actually made up of a range of very different kinds of experiences, some of which, as you've rightly described in your discussion of crisis, are not reducible to perceivable events. And so I'm wondering why this term violence, and maybe you discuss it in the book and we haven't here, where that kind of sits in relation to your discussion.
I mean, it's the sort of I didn't discuss it in here because I already felt like I was doing a lot of kind of conceptual and theoretical movement, and I wanted to have some stuff that we could look at together to work through. But in the introduction to the book, there's like I don't know, 1,000 words or something on violence and how I'm understanding it, because the book is really about like non-human witnessing in context of violence. So in the three examples today, they're the ecological violence of nuclear war, the future potential and very real, of course, violence of drone warfare as something that is like produced and anticipated through technological systems. And then also the question of like how we might adopt investigative techniques that respond to forms of violence that are hard to discern, which of course, is huge, which is the core of what forensic architecture has been about. But I wanted to think about that along a slightly different line. So yeah, I mean the whole book in many ways is about violence, and Rob Nixon's work and that of several others is like an important part of of how I think about it.
Thank you so much again. That's it. I promise not to ask any more.
No, it's great because like you've 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 given me the opportunity to elaborate the things that that I cut out of of what I would have time to talk about. So it's kind of like exactly the sorts of questions that help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. I'll perhaps I know it's it's getting late for you, Michael, over there. I'll perhaps, if no one else in the who's still in this meeting has a question, I'll perhaps just end with one final kind of area of the book that I don't think we've touched upon, and that's again in the introduction. You suggest that non-human witnessing describes a critical concept in relational practice of a distinct mode of communication, one constituted by an address that demands response but still embraces opacity. And I'm really interested in this idea of opacity and its kind of, I guess, radical potential. And I'm thinking here particularly of kind of Glissant's insistence on an opacity as a strategy for the survival of Black life. I'm just wondering if you could perhaps kind of map out a little bit more your deployment of opacity, or your kind of critical framing of opacity in the book in relation to the non-human, and that the ways in which that kind of raises a kind of series of kind of, I guess, different ontological and epistemological questions.
Thank you. So I think if we want to accept that, if we're willing to accept or at least run with the idea that there might be a non-human witnessing or a more than human witnessing, however we might put it, then we need to deal with or recognize the point where what is being witnessed and how that witnessing is taking place is not reducible to human modes of knowing and human capacities for conception and understanding. And that might be in a quite radical sense, in the sense that, like, you know, can we as humans know how stars feel or how an atom experiences? So let alone, and that's true, but it's also true that, like, you know, in Glissant's terms, like there is like a fundamental opacity as a kind of relation between ways of experiencing the world and being in the world and becoming in and with the world. And so you know, I think that the importance of that opacity at every level, I think is really significant for me. And I think, I think that that opacity is different from unknowing or an inability to know, and respecting opacity and starting from the point of opacity rather than transparency or totality or objectivity or whatever begins us from a very different point. And so in some ways, I think we can kind of bring this into relation with, you know, say like Haraway's famous critique of the God's eye view of objective knowledge, the God trick of objectivity. We can sort of start to bring these things together into how we think about knowledge systems, but knowledge systems as necessarily political. So to come back briefly to what I said before about like the necessity of thinking about a world of many worlds, you know, I think opacity has to be at the core of that. Because otherwise, as soon as we enable like a pluriverse or many modes of knowing and being, human and non-human, entangled and ecological and so on, we run into this trap again of like, well, is it one totality? And what does it mean to say it's a totality? Like every system might be interconnected in certain ways, but like what are we making then a claim of omniscience or potential omniscience about a particular mode of knowledge? And we know from like many kinds of non-Western, non-Enlightenment forms of knowledge, non-techno-scientific forms of knowledge or approaches to knowledge, that like an acceptance of opacity and limitation and a kind of sightedness of how we might know and how we might understand the world is like really crucial, and accepting accepting the opacity of certain experiences and certain kinds of relations, like is actually is not a weakness at all. It's actually the reverse. And so, yeah, to me, how we deal with that opacity and how that then might become like central to the politics of plural epistemologies is a tricky question. And yeah, one of the reviewers of the final manuscript was like, look, my big question would be like, how does that all happen in practice then? And I was like, well, maybe that's like for the critics, or maybe that's for like another book down the line. But I think that's a big and important question.
Thank you so much, Michael, for really great talk and a great set of responses to the brilliant questions we've had today. I'll perhaps just end with Deborah's comment. So she says, "Thank you so much, Michael. Fascinating work, beautifully articulated. Very much look forward to reading your book." Yeah, lots of thank yous coming in through the chat, and just like to mention that future events will be keep on looking at counterevidentiaryfutures.com. There'll be more information on forthcoming events, or feel free to email me at p.b.smith@salford.ac.uk. But yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And yeah, I guess
thank you, Patrick, and thank you everybody for the wonderful questions and the kind comments. It's greatly appreciated.